Tensions are running high in Eastern Europe as tens of thousands of Russian forces are amassing near the Ukrainian border. Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Russian Navy on Wednesday began drills in the Black Sea. Sometime this week, 2 U.S. warships are expected to arrive in the region. Washington and NATO are expressing alarm over the gathering of Russian forces near Ukraine and in Crimea. Russia says it's responding to a NATO threat. Julia Chapman reports from Moscow.
Ukraine says some 80,000 Russian soldiers are stationed along its borders. The Russian government doesn't deny the buildup.
We are asked what the Russian Federation is doing on the border with Ukraine. The answer is very simple. We live here. It's our country. What is the US doing with their ships, their military personnel, who constantly organize some kind of events alongside NATO, thousands of kilometers from their own territory? This question remains unanswered so far.
Russia accuses Ukraine of escalating tensions by closing media outlets and sanctioning pro-Russian figures. Kiev also adopted a military strategy for what it calls the deoccupation of Crimea. The Kremlin insists it has no desire for a war, but warns of provocative actions by Ukraine and its allies. Deputy Russian Foreign Minister Serhiy Ryabkov says the US and NATO are turning Ukraine into a powder keg. He says Moscow will continue to defend the interests of ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine. But in Kiev, those words sound like warmongering. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia wants the West to be afraid. What's less clear is what it's hoping to achieve with that fear. Analysts think if an invasion was imminent, it would have less warning.
I think Russia wants to send a very clear message to Ukraine and also to the new US administration that it will not accept a military solution to the conflict. It is concerned that the new administration may try to push Kyiv in some offense, into some desperate offense, just to provoke a war and to drag Russia into it.
Whatever Russia's motivations for the buildup, tensions are at their highest point since 2014. And even a small incident could lead to much bigger consequences. Julia Chapman, CGTN, Moscow.
To discuss the situation there, earlier I spoke with Volodymyr Yelchenko. He is the Ukrainian Ambassador to the United States. And I started by asking him what's the latest along the border between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, the things stand at a not very good level, I would say. That, of course, it was an unprecedented visit of President Zelensky. I think he was accompanied by a CNN correspondent, and it was all on the screens, not only in Ukraine, but all over the world, and in the United States, of course. The main purpose was to support our military who are on the front line. And given the unseen escalation on the Russian side during the recent days, they deployed additional thousands of forces along the Russian-Ukraine state border, especially along the part of the border which is not controlled by the government of Ukraine, but controlled by Russian proxies and Russians, of course, themselves. There is a constant flow of ammunition, personnel, and fuel to the occupied part of the eastern Ukraine. Altogether, there is up to 100,000 of Russian troops along the border, and 28,000 of them are either very close to the border or on the Ukrainian side. A lot of tanks, artillery, heavy artillery, rocket systems, and some military experts even say that this is the highest level of the concentration of troops in Europe since the Second World War, which says for itself. In parallel, Russia is continuing propaganda campaign and disseminating a lot of fake news with the main purpose to demonstrate to the local population, this is for internal use, of course, in Russia, that it's Ukraine which is violating the ceasefire, and as if Ukraine is preparing for the major military assault in the eastern part in order to take back the territories which are not controlled by Ukrainian ground.
Let me ask you about that, because Moscow, of course, is insisting this is just a military exercise. The troops are within Russian territory. They're not a threat to Ukraine. And the U.S. just held military exercises with the Republic of Korea right along the border with the DPRK. And every time that happens, Pyongyang says, you know, this is just a rehearsal for war. Russia leaders often say that the United States plays by two sets of rules. You know, when they do it, it's just an exercise. When Russia does the same sort of thing, it's a double standard. They're being threatening. Give me your sense on how you view that.
Well, you see, it's always like this when you deal with Russia. If I may recall, probably some people don't remember, long ago, back in 1939, a couple of days before the beginning of the so-called Soviet-Finnish War, which was the prelude, well, to the Second World War, in fact, there was a so-called Manila accident. The Russian artillery shelled their own positions, and then it was announced by then Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, of course, that it was a shelling from the Finnish side, and the Soviet army immediately, you know, started the offensive with the purpose to protect, you know, their forces. So this is the very similar situation, I think. Russia is trying to create the picture that Ukraine is preparing for major military assault against so-called Russian-speaking population in the eastern part of Ukraine, which are the Ukrainian citizens, of course. I would also add that it's probably not as much, you know, commented in the media, but we have the counterintelligence information intercepted by our people, our military, that there are at least 3 possible options are being prepared of the official letter, official request from the so-called representatives of, they call it Donetsk Republic, addressed to President Putin with the 3 optional requests. First is to protect the local population by giving the military assistance from Russia. Second option is to recognize the independence of Donbass. And the third is to grant the possibility of, you know, parts of Donbass to reunite, as they say, with the Russian Federation. So this is sort of 3 scenarios possible, you know, further developments, right, which are being considered. I would also add that, according to our information, there is an extraordinary meeting of Russian Duma planned for this Thursday, in a couple of days, which may well consider, you know, this request if it's materialized. So we need to keep all options in mind, and we know how Russia, you know, acts, and we're prepared for anything. Although Ukraine, of course, is in favor of peaceful diplomatic solution of this conflict, but we're ready to fight if necessary.
Well, and you're making some allegations against Russia. Let me get you to give you a chance to kind of address some of the charges that they've made, which is that your country created tensions by closing TV channels in the country that were pro-Kremlin, also sanctions. Just give us a sense of how you would respond to some of these allegations.
As far as the channels are concerned, which you mentioned, there are 2 or 3 of them which being consequently used as a tool of Russian propaganda, openly calling for independence of Donbass, you know, creating the picture of the situation in Ukraine, which is far from the truth. But unfortunately, there are some people, even in Ukraine, and was the majority in Russia, who really believe that this is true. So you create the picture, artificial picture, which is very far from the reality, and then you start to believe in it. So that's the typical way the Russian propaganda acts. And you mentioned the military exercises. Yes, Russia, conducts military exercises every year, but this is the unseen level of concentration of Russian troops, never before. And not only in Crimea, which, as they claim, is the part of Russia, but also along the border between Russia and Ukraine. For example, around 150 kilometers from the border, there is the major Russian city of Voronezh, where we spotted, and the Western, NATO intelligence as well, spotted the huge concentration, the huge military camp, which never been there. I mean, Voronezh is a totally peaceful city. There are no military bases there, but now they are deploying the huge military camp with thousands of troops and equipment and tanks and APCs and so on. What for? I mean, Ukraine is not going to attack Russia. Why should you have this kind of concentration of troops just, a couple of miles from the border with Ukraine?
Mr. Ambassador, let me ask you about this phone call that Joe Biden, the U.S. president, had with Vladimir Putin this week, where they talked about Ukraine and a number of issues where there are disagreements between the United States and Russia. And he suggested a summit between these two leaders in another third-party country. Is that a good venue for them to try and hash out some of these problems surrounding Ukraine? Is this something you welcome? Should the West be doing more? Are they doing enough in your estimation?
Well, I think that, it seems to me at least, I'm deeply convinced that the main purpose of this call was to make sure to send a clear signal to Putin that if he goes further in Ukraine, in case of further aggressive developments, and of course, if it's a military attack of Ukraine, the consequences will be much more serious than in 2014. Because then, I think that the Western countries were simply not ready. They didn't believe that Russia should go as far as taking Crimea and intervening into the eastern part of Ukraine. But now, of course, it's obvious. And NATO is on alert. And as I said, that was the main topic in the conversation between President Biden and President Putin. The one which happened, 2 weeks ago, and the one which happened just now, I think, today.
Ambassador Yelchenko, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
To continue our discussion, let's bring in our panelists from Dallas. Serhiy Kudelia is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. He joins us via Skype. I want to welcome all of you to the show. Anton, why don't I start with you? You just heard the interview there with the ambassador. He talked about these counterintelligence intercepts, this Duma meeting coming up on Thursday. I want to get your thoughts on what he had to say. And also, what do you think are the motivations for amassing all these troops on the border for Russia?
Well, look, the Russians have made it clear that they are sending a signal, which they're doing openly, and you didn't need much counterintelligence to see the concentration of troops, because there was massive presence on social media. No one hid this. The numbers that I've seen from both Western and Russian experts are not in the hundreds of thousands. They're much smaller. They're somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000, which is unusual for this time of the year, but certainly not out of the ordinary. And if the Russians were really going to go in, they would have many more troops than they actually have along that border. But the signal is unmistakable, and it is meant to be a signal, which is that if the Ukrainians try to settle the conflict in the Donbass and in other areas, potentially even in try to reclaim the Crimea by force, they will be met with counterforce, which will be disproportionate, and it will be greater. And let me just mention two things that are happening in the background, just to contextualize things. First of all, NATO is conducting the biggest exercise that it's done in the East currently, called Defender Europe 2021, with 28,000 troops from 27 countries, and that's been going on since mid-March. And then on the 24th of March, the Ukrainian president signed the decree, aiming, this is what you referred to, Mike, sort of laying out the policy of reclaiming occupied territory. And I think the combination of these two things is what alerted Moscow to a potential split-hair decision on the part of Kiev. So all of this is a signal from the Russians not to do this.
Serhiy, let me ask you about this. You heard the Ukrainian ambassador. He's concerned about this troop buildup. The U.S. also chiming in about this as well. But then you hear from Russia. I mean, the defense minister, the foreign minister, they're all blaming the U.S. and NATO with moving troops near its border. They're also saying that there's these regular visits by Navy ships from the United States to the Black Sea. They describe that as openly provocative. So we kind of hear the same complaints on both sides. How do you measure all of this?
Well, I think that it certainly has an international dimension. Russia traditionally has viewed the conflict with Ukraine through a geopolitical lens of the confrontation with the United States. And I think to a large extent, the response that we're seeing now with the troop buildup is a response to a series of very assertive, aggressive, tough rhetoric that came out of the Biden administration over the last couple of months that culminated with that famous remark of President Biden that Putin is a killer. And as we know, it has been taken as a personal affront by President Putin. And I think he wanted to show to the new administration that Russia still has an edge in case an escalation continues. Because ultimately what Russia can do is it can send its troops to Ukraine. It can deploy its troops. It can fight on Ukrainian territory. And that is what this buildup shows. Americans or NATO troops would not be sent to Ukraine. No American president would want to risk a war with Russia over Ukraine. There is no direct national security interest there for the United States. And for that reason, for all the rhetoric that we hear from Washington that they are supporting Ukrainian independence and integrity, the fact remains that Russia ultimately has a coercive advantage over Ukraine. And that explains why yesterday President Biden made this call to President Putin with an intent to de-escalate and with intent to invite him to the summit for the personal meeting.
Is that going to be enough to de-escalate things?
For now, I think this should settle it. I think we are clearly on a path of de-escalation. It's still not clear what the details of that summit would be, but Biden, at least with this offer, intends to show that the United States is going to respect Russia as an equal partner. And in that, he is certainly very much different from the way Obama administration, or President Obama himself, treated Putin in 2014. Remember, President Obama chose a very dismissive attitude towards Russia, viewed Russia as an inferior, a declining, a weak power, and never really wanted to engage Putin directly to help Ukraine. Biden is very different in this regard, and he is willing to recognize and give certain degree of respect to Putin as the president, as a leader of a major power, in order to resolve the crisis over Ukraine.
Brian, it's not just the U.S. and Ukraine, of course, that are complaining about this, the troop movements. German Chancellor Angela Merkel asked Putin to kind of de-escalate things as well. Here's NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg weighing in on all of this. Let's listen.
Russia's considerable military buildup is unjustified, unexplained, and deeply concerning. Russia must end this military buildup in and around Ukraine, stop its provocations, and de-escalate immediately.
Brian, I want to get your thoughts on this. I want you to weigh in because this is, basically NATO talking about two countries that neither of them are NATO members that are having a dispute here. Do they really have a place trying to, chime in on all of this?
Well, you see, the Ukrainian foreign minister is meeting with Jens Stoltenberg and NATO, and I think there's a short-term issue here, and then there's the longer-term issue. And the longer-term issue is that following the coup d'etat, which I think truly shocked the Russian government back February 22nd, 2014, ousted the Yanukovych government that had played between East and West. and created a pro-Western, anti-Russian government in the aftermath. The long-term plan there is to move Ukraine into NATO. I mean, let's remember, Ukraine and Russia used to be one country. Crimea was part of Russia until it was transferred in 1954 as an administrative measure by Nikita Khrushchev, when the two countries were one country. And now the idea that that Ukraine, the second largest former Soviet republic after Russia, might be integrated into NATO, and I think that's clearly the plans of the Ukrainian government, that's profoundly disturbing and threatening to Russia, because it means NATO troops will be carrying out massive exercises at the Russian border going forward. It's a process that's unfinished, but I think part of the jockeying here is precisely over this question: will Ukraine go into NATO? The second point, real quick, is that I think the Russians were startled in February 2014. They didn't expect the coup d'etat. They felt that the Americans were really behind it, along with the Germans. And that seizure of power that ended the sort of neutrality of Ukraine was shocking. I think Russia doesn't want to be shocked once again, so they're being additionally prepared at this moment.
And Serhiy, let's talk about that, because Ukraine really is not making much of a secret that they'd like to be a NATO member. And to Brian's point, if that's the case, if they were to become a part of NATO, that would mean actually troops could be on the border there, about 500 kilometers away from Moscow, and that would be a concern for the leadership in Moscow.
I agree with that, but we also know, and the leadership in Moscow knows that very well, that NATO has a long-standing policy of not bringing in to that alliance countries that have unresolved disputes on its borders. And Ukraine currently have two unresolved disputes. It has a dispute over Crimea and has a dispute over Donbass. And for that reason, as long as these two conflicts remain active, there is no chance that Ukraine will ever be admitted into the NATO alliance. And that sort of presents, in a way, a catch-22 situation, because it certainly incentivizes Russia to make sure that these conflicts are unresolved for as long as Ukraine claims it wants to be a member of NATO. But it also creates an incentive for Ukraine. It should create an incentive for Ukraine to consider the possibility of becoming a permanently neutral state along the lines of Finland, for example, or Austria, in order to finally settle some of these conflicts. And so maybe that would be something that would become part of the negotiations or talks that we would see between Biden and Putin, with Ukraine's participation as well.
Anton, Russia likes to point out that back in 1990, then Secretary of State James Baker, for cooperation on German reunification, said that basically the U.S. would make an ironclad guarantee that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. And of course, they feel rather aggrieved about this because they really haven't stood up to that gentleman's agreement.
Well, that's right. And look, this issue has been mulled over many times. Gorbachev should have known better than to trust words. He should have insisted on a written agreement. And even if that had happened, let's remember that the country with which that agreement would have been signed by the West, had it ever been signed, would have been gone by the end of 1991. And then, you know, the question of whether or even a written agreement, had there been one, would have been, you know, legally binding, would have been an open question. I think the issue now is really the question of the future of NATO. And I think it's very interesting that we're discussing this issue of expansion today, when NATO officially declared that it is going to be withdrawing from Afghanistan over the next few months. Sounds like by the middle of September, by September 11th, we'll see what happens. Look, NATO has been very successful as a bureaucratic organization, as a standoff organization, but when it comes to actually fighting conflicts, its record is less than stellar. I mean, there was Yugoslavia in the late 1990s, which wasn't a great military achievement against a power. There was Libya with its disastrous consequences, and there was Afghanistan, 20 years, and very little achieved, if that. So the idea that NATO is somehow going to make itself or Ukraine more secure by absorbing it, and I agree with Serhiy that that's not even on the table, certainly not with the territorial issues. This is something that only a bureaucracy can argue in order to to position Russia as a threat and to increase its budgets. But whether it can actually deliver is a different question. I just hope that behind closed doors, both in Brussels and NATO headquarters, and between the Americans and the Ukrainians, the message coming from the West is don't make the same mistake that Saakashvili made, the Georgian president back in 2008, because he mistook assurances of Western support for promises of Western military intervention in case of a war with Russia, and we all know how that ended, both for Saakashvili, who can't come back to his country, and for Georgia, which lost 2 territories.
Serhiy, let me ask you about, because I saw an interview with you some years back where you were talking about the Obama administration and their diplomatic efforts, and you basically said, look, he made a mistake, he outsourced things to the Europeans. Then you look at the Trump administration, and it seemed like that relationship with Ukraine was more, hey, play ball with us so that we can discredit Biden and his son. It just seems like such a murky relationship between the United States and Ukraine. How do things stand with the Biden administration moving forward, do you think?
Well, the Biden administration is very different because Biden himself, I think, is the first president who knows Ukraine very well, and he visited Ukraine multiple times, had high-level relationships with Ukrainian political elites. So he knows the country from the inside out. He knows its problems. He recognizes that it faces a massive corruption issue. He recognizes the issue with the oligarchs, and there has been a lot of pressure over oligarchs like Igor Kolomoisky over the last couple of months. But at the same time, I think Biden genuinely is committed to assisting Ukraine personally. I think there is a personal commitment that he feels to Ukraine. And for that reason, I am more hopeful about the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine. I think he will try to negotiate with Putin directly some kind of a settlement to the conflict over the next couple of years. But that would require really a change of tone, not only from Biden himself, but from other key officials in the Biden administration. In the first couple of months, we've seen that they used a lot of threats of use of sanctions. Very tough rhetoric was coming out. That is certainly not the way that Russia and the United States would be able to reconcile their differences over Ukraine.
Well, we're certainly going to keep an eye on it. Thank you all for your perspectives. Really appreciate chatting with the three of you. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.